The laughter started before Elsa Doyle could even lift the lid off the box. She'd come straight from her shift, still in the black and white uniform of a housemaid, because there hadn't been time to go home and change, and the birthday cake in her arms had taken her 14 hours to build. 4 tiers. Every petal piped by hand at 4 in the morning. She was 5 minutes late. On the 40th floor of a restaurant she couldn't ever afford to eat in, Sabrina Vaughn looked her up and down and asked whether she'd come to deliver the cake or to clean up after it. Somebody laughed. Somebody else said it looked homemade. Sabrina tossed a $20 bill onto the table and told her to take it back. Elsa didn't argue, and she didn't beg. She just kept one hand flat on the box, the way you hold something you built with your own 2 hands. And then a voice came from the doorway, quiet, unhurried, the kind of voice a room gets out of the way for. How much? Caspian Castellano crossed that floor without looking at a single person in it. He didn't admire the flowers. He didn't ask what flavor it was. He tilted the base of the cake up 3 inches and looked underneath at the part nobody in that room had ever thought to look at, and his hand stopped moving. 12 years, he said. 12 years since I've seen this mark. Who taught you to make it? Not one person at that table understood what was happening. They only understood it 30 seconds later, when the most powerful man in Chicago named his price for a cake they'd just called garbage, and the whole room went silent. Before we find out what Elsa said next, do me a favor, hit that like button, share this with someone who's ever been judged by the uniform they were wearing, and subscribe so you won't miss where this one goes. Now let's get back to the story. No one in the room moved. Sabrina Vaughn was the first to find her voice again, and she chose the method she knew best, the one that had worked for her throughout all 26 years of her life. She named a price. Mr. Castellano, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. This cake is worth $200 at most. Caspian didn't turn toward her. He was still looking down at the place his fingers had just touched, the wood beneath the base of the cake, where 3 small marks had remained hidden and silent for 14 hours, without a single person in that room knowing they existed. Then I'll pay 250 times that. Someone drew in a sharp breath. Richard Vaughn set his wineglass down on the table a little harder than necessary. He had sat across from Caspian Castellano enough times to understand that this man never said a number twice, and he never said a number he hadn't already finished calculating. Caspian looked up and found the restaurant manager standing frozen in the corner of the room. Go down to the front desk. Issue an invoice for an event cake order. The buyer is Castellano Hospitality Group. Get the tax identification number from your system. You've been doing business with us for 3 years. For the seller, use the exact business name listed on Miss Doyle's license. I want the invoice to include the full date and time, a complete product description, and signatures from both parties. The manager swallowed hard. Yes, sir. The amount is $50,000. Corporate check. I'll sign it downstairs. Elsa heard every word clearly, but her mind couldn't process them fast enough. Her hand was still resting on the lid of the box, in the exact position she had held for the past 4 minutes. There was only one small, almost ridiculous thought in her head at that moment, that if the man changed his mind and walked away, she would still have to carry this cake down 40 floors, make her way to the station, and hold it in her arms all the way back to Bridgeport, on the last train of the night. Caspian turned toward her. For the first time that entire evening, he looked directly into someone's face. What was the agreed price, Miss Doyle? It took Elsa a second to realize he was speaking to her. $240. You quoted that price for a 4-tier cake? Yes. Why? She could have lied. She had lied about many things over the past 2 years. Small, neat lies that could answer a question without requiring any thought. But she didn't lie about this, because I needed the order. Caspian gave a single nod. That was the agreed price. It wasn't its value. He took out a pen, signed the corporate check. The manager had just hurried upstairs to bring him, tore it free, and didn't hand it to Elsa. Instead, he placed it on the table beside the $20 bill Sabrina had thrown down earlier, then pushed both pieces of paper toward Elsa with 2 fingers. The difference between them lay there on the polished wood for everyone in the room to see. Then he turned to the manager one last time. This banquet is canceled. Don't charge the Vaughn family. Don't serve anything else. Have the room cleared in 10 minutes. Sabrina let out a short laugh, the kind that came from someone who still couldn't believe this was happening to her. You can't. This restaurant has been part of our portfolio since 2022. He still didn't look at her. You can check. It's public record. Richard Vaughn rose from his chair. His face had gone pale, not from anger, but because he was the only person in the room who fully understood that what had just happened had nothing to do with the cake. And he also understood that the 3 contracts awaiting his signature had just been placed on a scale he wasn't permitted to see. He said his daughter's name once, very softly. Sabrina didn't get up. Caspian had already turned back toward Elsa. He stood about 3 feet from her, his arms resting at his sides, and when he asked the question again, his voice had changed. It was slower now, lower, as though he were afraid that if he asked too loudly, the answer might disappear. Who taught you to make that mark? My grandmother. He didn't ask the next question right away. He stood still for about 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, Elsa saw something very strange pass across the man's face. Something that looked exactly like the expression of a person preparing to open a door they had been standing in front of for a very long time. What was her name? This was the point Elsa had reached hundreds of times before. At clinics, at banks, at work, anywhere someone asked whether she had any family. She had learned that if she answered briefly, people stopped asking. But if she gave them more, they asked another question. And she didn't have the strength for the questions that came after. So she answered the way she had been answering for the past 2 years. With one clean sentence, in the calm voice of someone who had practiced saying it so many times that it no longer seemed to hurt. My grandmother is gone. Caspian nodded, very slowly. He didn't ask another word. He lifted one hand as though he were about to do something, then let it fall again, and Elsa saw his knuckles tighten slightly, only slightly, before relaxing. I'm sorry, I asked. He seemed to say it more to the floor than to her. Then he turned away and walked straight through the rows of chairs, past untouched napkins still folded neatly at every place setting, all the way to the elevator. And he didn't look back once. The elevator doors closed behind him. Elsa remained where she was, one hand still resting on the lid of the box, the other holding a check for $50,000 that she hadn't yet dared to read closely. And at that moment there wasn't a single thought in her mind except that the cake had an owner now, and she still had to make the train home. 18 hours earlier, at 4:40 in the morning, Elsa Doyle was kneeling on the floor of her studio apartment in Bridgeport, lowering her eyes until they were level with the final tier of the cake. She had been on her feet since 2 o'clock the previous afternoon. The apartment was only one room, and the folding table pushed against the window served as both her dining table and her baking station. She had even had to pull the mini refrigerator out into the middle of the walkway, just to make enough room for the turntable. The top tier leaned slightly to the left, by perhaps 1/25 of an inch. No one would ever have noticed. She took the entire tier off, adjusted the support ring inside, then set it back in place. At 4:53, she finished the final flower petal. Her phone vibrated at 5:15. The number belonged to Rosewood Memory Care, and Elsa knew exactly what they were calling to say before she even answered. The woman from the billing department spoke very gently, with the voice of someone who had to deliver the same message many times every week. The overdue balance on Vera Kowalczyk's account was now $14,200. The Medicaid application submitted in February was still under asset review, with no decision yet. Rosewood was a private facility and didn't accept Medicaid, so even if the application was approved, Vera would still have to move. And if the outstanding balance wasn't resolved within the next 30 days, they would be required to begin the process of transferring her to a public facility. Elsa asked which public facility. The woman said it would depend on wherever a bed was available. Elsa said she understood, thanked her, and ended the call before her voice had time to change. She opened her wallet and counted what was inside. $61. She had quoted $240 for this order, for a completely handmade 4-tier cake, nearly half the market price, because when the inquiry first came in, there had been even less money in her wallet than there was now, and she had needed the order more than she had needed a fair price. She placed the cake in the refrigerator, secured the door with the same rubber band she always used, then went to shower. At 6:10, she left the apartment. At exactly 7 o'clock, she arrived at the Castellano estate in Lake Forest. And as she did every day, she signed her name in the service entrance log, collected her access card, and went upstairs to the second floor. Her responsibility was the second floor, the library, and the east corridor. The same route, the same order, unchanged for 5 months. On her first day, Delia Wren, the head housekeeper, had walked her through the house and given her very few instructions. Only 3 things she was expected to remember. Don't use your phone in the upstairs areas. Don't accept anything from guests. And the third rule came when they reached the end of the east corridor and stopped in front of a dark wooden door with no sign, no decoration, nothing unusual about it except that the handle bore not a single scratch. The last door in the east corridor, Delia had said, never open it. Elsa had asked what was inside. Delia had told her that she had worked there for 11 years, and didn't know either, that she had never asked, and that answer was enough for Elsa to understand that this wasn't the kind of question anyone asked twice in that house. For 5 months, whenever she cleaned her way down to that door, she stopped, turned around, and went back downstairs. She had never met the owner of the house either. People said he spent more time in Chicago than he did there, and the household staff didn't use his name. They simply said he. To Elsa, he was a name printed on her employment contract, and the reason the 2 security guards at the top of the stairs fell silent every time she pushed her cleaning cart through the hallway. Her shift that day was supposed to end at 3 o'clock. Close to 2, guests arrived in 3 cars, and Delia made the rounds telling every member of staff that they would need to stay late. Elsa cleaned the entire library for the 2nd time that day. She finally clocked out at 3:40. The cake had to be on the 40th floor by 5 o'clock. From Lake Forest back to Bridgeport, then from Bridgeport into downtown, took 2.5 hours if every train ran on time, and the trains never all ran on time. She stood in the staff lobby for exactly 4 seconds, doing the math, then abandoned the idea of going home to change clothes. She went straight there only long enough to pick up the cake, then walked back out the door, still wearing the same clothes she had worked in all day. On the train platform, she had already decided she would sit in the last row of the car, where fewer people passed by. But when the train arrived, she didn't sit at all. She stood in the open space near the doors, both hands slipped beneath the base of the box, her elbows braced against her hips to keep it steady, and she stayed that way for the entire 40-minute ride. Each time the train slowed, she bent her knees slightly so the force would travel into her legs instead of her arms. An older woman sitting nearby gestured for Elsa to take her seat. Elsa shook her head and said thank you, but if she put the box down, it would tilt. The woman watched her for a moment, then stopped asking. No one on that train asked what was inside the box, and Elsa had no one to tell anyway. Her mother had died in 2017, and her father had never been around enough to be worth mentioning. It was nearly 11 o'clock at night before Elsa finally opened the door to her apartment. She set her bag down, turned on the light, and took the check out of her coat pocket with 2 fingers, as though it were wet. She placed it on the folding table, in the same spot where the turntable and piping bags had still been sitting the night before, then took 1 step back. She didn't touch it again. She stood there looking at the piece of paper, then went to wash her hands, then came back and looked at it some more. All the way home, she had thought of 3 possibilities. The check would bounce, the check would be canceled before she had time to deposit it, or someone would call her tomorrow morning, say there had been a mistake, and ask her to return the money. None of those 3 possibilities made her feel any better, but all 3 were easier to believe than the 4th. She sat down on the edge of the bed, and because she didn't know what to do with her hands, she looked down at them. On the back of her right hand was an old crescent-shaped burn, a mark left by the oven in the bakery where her grandmother used to work. In 2007, Elsa was 9 years old, standing on a stool so she could reach the steel work table. Vera placed a half-finished 2-tier cake in front of her and told her to pipe flowers across the surface. Elsa finished them slowly and carefully, then looked up and waited to be praised. Vera didn't praise her. Instead, she pressed one hand gently into the center of the top tier. The cake sank, leaned, then collapsed at one corner. "Anyone can put flowers on the outside," she said, "but a cake falls because of what's inside." Then she made Elsa start over from the beginning, and this time she didn't allow her to touch a piping bag. Vera took a thin wooden board from a drawer, handed Elsa a utility knife, and told her to cut. Cut it so it fits exactly. No gaps. No forcing it in. Elsa ruined 4 boards. On the 5th, Vera nodded. After that, she taught her to cook sugar into hardened rings, let them cool, and thread them between the tiers instead of using plastic dowels. "Plastic dowels are cheaper," Elsa said. "Plastic dowels don't die with the cake," Vera replied. At the end of the day, when both tiers had set, Vera turned the cake board upside down. She took the smallest piping bag she owned, fitted with a tip no wider than the point of a needle, and piped 3 marks onto the wood, 3 upright strokes standing side by side, each one lined with tiny beads along its length. Elsa asked what they were. "Barley," Vera said. 3 stalks. Then she turned the board over again and placed the cake on top, hiding all 3 marks completely. Elsa asked why she would pipe them somewhere no one would ever see. Vera wiped her hands on her apron and answered as though it were something so obvious there was no reason to emphasize it. "The part no one sees is the part that keeps everything standing." She didn't explain another word. She only told Elsa that from then on, she had to make those marks on every cake she ever made, whether it was sold, given away, ruined, or thrown into the trash. 18 years later, sitting on the edge of the bed in her Bridgeport apartment, Elsa was still doing exactly that. She had piped the 3 barley stalks onto the base of tonight's cake a little before 4 o'clock in the morning, when both her hands were trembling from standing for so long, and she had done it by reflex, without thinking, the way someone signs their name at the end of a letter they know no one will ever read all the way through. She stood up, picked up her phone, and opened her banking app. She had photographed the check and submitted the mobile deposit while she was still on the train, standing on the platform waiting to transfer lines, one hand still supporting the cake box, and she had done it only because she was afraid that if she waited until morning, she would change her mind and lose the courage to deposit it at all. The screen showed that the transaction was being processed, and that 90% of the funds would be available on the next business day. Beneath that was her new balance. Elsa stared at the number for a very long time. She read it 3 times, counted the digits, then enlarged the screen to make sure she hadn't misread the comma. 30 seconds earlier, she had still been calculating whether she should pay Rosewood $1,000 or $1,200 the following week, so they might delay the transfer process for a few more days. Now there was nothing left to calculate. She placed the phone face down on the table, sat back on the edge of the bed, and for about 2 seconds, she was still completely fine. Then she lifted one hand to cover her mouth, and she cried. She cried without making a sound, folding forward, her shoulders shaking in waves. And she cried that way for a very long time, much longer than she had allowed herself to cry at any point during the past 2 years. She wasn't crying because of the money. She was crying because tonight, in a room full of people, exactly one person had bent down to look at the part no one else ever looked at. And that person had been a complete stranger. It was nearly 1 o'clock in the morning before she was able to stand again. She washed her face, wiped down the table, and before turning off the light, she opened the bottom drawer and took out a cloth-bound notebook faded with age. She didn't read it. She only rested her hand on the cover for a moment, then put it back. On Monday morning, she still had a shift in Lake Forest, exactly at 7 o'clock. At 7:20 on Monday morning, Elsa pushed her cleaning cart up to the library door, just as she did every day. She knocked twice as required, then opened the door without waiting, because in all 5 months she had worked there had never once been anyone inside. This time, there was. The man was sitting in the chair near the window, one hand resting on the armrest, with no papers in front of him, no phone, nothing at all. He sat like someone who had already been there for quite some time. Elsa stepped back half a pace, her hand still gripping the handle of the cart. She recognized him immediately, and at the same moment, she realized something she hadn't thought about once in the past 2 days. He was the owner of this house. He stood up. That unsettled Elsa even more than finding him there, because in 5 months of working in this house, she had never seen anyone stand up in front of a cleaning woman. "I'm sorry. I didn't know anyone was in here," she said, already beginning to pull the cart backward. "Stay, Miss Doyle." Elsa stopped. Out in the hallway, Delia Wren had just reached the top of the stairs when she froze, one hand still resting on the banister. "I had someone check the household staff list Friday night," he said. "Elsa Doyle, hourly employee, started in March. You've been in my house for 5 months, and I've been looking for the person who made that mark for 12 years. Elsa didn't understand what he was saying. She understood every word, but she didn't understand the sentence. She stood there with both hands gripping the handle of the cleaning cart, and the first thing that came into her mind wasn't curiosity. It was fear. She had lived long enough to know that when someone in his position took notice of someone in hers, most of the time it ended with the person in her position losing her job. "Sir," she said, "I'm resigning. Effective today." Outside in the hallway, Delia took half a step forward, then stopped again. "Why?" he asked. "I don't think I should stay here anymore." "I asked why, Miss Doyle." Elsa looked down at the floor. "Friday night, you paid me an amount of money I didn't deserve, and I still took it. Now I'm standing in your house again with a mop cart. If I stay, everyone in this house is going to make up a story, and I know exactly what that story will be. I'd rather leave." Caspian didn't answer immediately. He looked at her the same way he had looked at the underside of the cake board, without rushing, without judging, simply looking. "If you want to resign, I'll sign it," he said. "Right now, if you want, and you'll still receive your full 2 weeks of pay under the contract. But don't resign because you think I pity you. I don't pity you." "Then what is it?" Elsa asked, and she was slightly startled by the sound of her own voice. He didn't answer that question. He walked around the chair, stopped about 6.5 feet away from her, and asked something entirely different. "Do you know anyone who used to sell baked goods in back of the yards?" Elsa blinked. "Sir, a small bakery," he said. It was in the middle of a row of buildings. The front sold bread and pastries, and the back door opened into an alley. The owner was a woman. She made honey cakes, poppy seed cakes, and she piped 3 stalks of barley under the base of everything she made. I need to find anyone who still knows about that bakery. Something passed through Elsa then, fast and cold, like missing a stare in the dark. But immediately after came 2 years of habit. The habit forged through hundreds of answers in clinics, banks, and every desk, where someone holding a pen had asked whether she had any family. Keep the answer short, and people stop asking. Say more, and they ask another question. And on Friday night, she had told this very man that her grandmother was gone. If she said anything different now, she would have to explain why she had lied, and she would have to explain everything that lay behind that lie. In room 214, of a place where she owed $14,200. No, sir, she said. I don't. Caspian watched her for another moment. You're sure? I grew up in Bridgeport. I don't know anyone in back of the yards. He nodded. It wasn't the nod of someone who believed her. It was the nod of someone who had decided to stop asking. All right, he said. If you remember anyone, tell Mrs. Wren. Then he sat down again. Go ahead with your work, Miss Doyle. I won't be here long. Elsa stood rooted to the floor for several seconds before she understood that he had just allowed her to stay and work in the same room with him, and that he wasn't going to say anything else. She pushed the cart inside, took out a cloth, and began dusting the shelves along the farthest wall. She worked exactly as she always did, no faster and no slower, and for the entire 40 minutes, she didn't look toward the chair even once. Caspian didn't say another word either. When Elsa pushed the cart back into the hallway, Delia was still standing at the top of the stairs. She didn't ask a question. She only watched Elsa walk past, her face pale, and it wasn't until Elsa had gone all the way down the final step that Delia whispered, softly enough that only she could hear herself, that she had worked in this house for 11 years and had never once seen him stand up for anyone. Caspian remained in the library for nearly another hour after Elsa left, and he wasn't thinking about anything she had just said. He was thinking about the winter of 2002, when he was 15 years old. His father had been shot during an internal purge in January of that year, and by February, the house, the 2 cars, and everything his family had once owned belonged to someone else. His mother took his younger sister to Cleveland to stay with a relative who only had enough room for the 2 of them. Caspian didn't go. He stayed in Chicago because he believed he could find the names of the men who had done it, and he remained there for 8 months. During those 8 months, he slept in a storage shed behind an abandoned auto repair shop on 47th Street in back of the yards. He learned to fall asleep before midnight and wake before 5 in the morning, because those were the 2 stretches of time when the fewest people passed through. He learned that hunger wasn't a constant feeling. It came in waves, and between those waves his mind became very clear, so clear that it was almost painful. He learned not to look anyone in the eyes. One Thursday evening near the end of March, he was walking past a narrow alley behind a row of red brick buildings when he noticed a back door standing slightly open, spilling a strip of yellow light across the wet pavement. From inside came the smell of warm butter. He stopped. He hadn't been standing there for more than 10 seconds when a woman stepped into the doorway, still holding a dish towel in one hand. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't ask what he was doing in her alley at 9 o'clock at night. She didn't ask why his coat was far too thin for March in Chicago. She simply looked him over once and asked, "Have you eaten?" Caspian didn't answer. She turned back inside, and he was about to leave, but before he could, she came out again, carrying a plate. There were 3 slices of cake on it. She set the plate on the concrete step instead of handing it to him, then stepped back inside and left the door slightly open just as it was. He ate all 3 slices standing there, and when he placed the plate back on the step, she came out again, picked it up, and carried it inside without saying a word. The following week, also on Thursday evening, the back door was open again. He stood at the mouth of the alley for a long time before walking toward it. She had already left a plate waiting on the step. By the 4th week, she no longer left the plate outside. She stood in the doorway with one hand braced against the frame and said, "Come inside. It's windy." The room beyond was a narrow, long kitchen with 2 ovens and a steel table running almost the entire length of the space. She told him to sit at the corner of the table nearest the door. When he finished eating, he stood up to leave, but she pointed toward a stack of dirty trays in the sink. "Wash those before you go." From that night on, he was no longer allowed to eat for nothing. She made him wash trays, and the next week she made him weigh flour. She didn't teach by explaining. She put the scale in front of him, called out a number, and made him do it again and again, until the needle stopped exactly where it was supposed to. She made him cut wooden cake supports, thin pieces that had to fit perfectly, with no gaps and no forcing them into place. And during those first 3 weeks, he ruined a great many of them. One evening, after the blade slipped away from the line for the 4th time, she stood on the other side of the steel table looking at his hands, then asked, "Are your hands shaking because you're hungry, or because you're angry?" Caspian didn't answer that question. She didn't ask again. She simply pushed another piece of wood toward him and said, "Do it again." She never asked his name. By around the 3rd month, she had started calling him Thursday, and she said it as though it were a perfectly ordinary name. "Thursday, get me the tray on the bottom. Thursday, weigh that flour again. Thursday, sit down and eat first." Some evenings, she talked a great deal, mostly about the cakes in the shop, which customer had ordered what, who had changed their mind again at the last minute. Other evenings, she didn't say a single word for 2 straight hours, and neither did he. He never told her about his father, about the house, or about the names he was searching for. She never asked, and it wasn't until much later in his life that Caspian understood that this was precisely why he returned the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that, for 8 months in a row. One evening in November, she turned a freshly dried cake board upside down, picked up the smallest piping bag she owned, and piped 3 marks onto the wood. He asked what she was doing. She said, 3 stalks of barley. He asked what they were for when no one would ever see them. She turned the board back over, placed the cake on top, and didn't answer him. She only said, "Come earlier next week. I have something I need a tall person for." He said yes. Near the end of November that year, on a Monday afternoon, a car pulled up in front of the abandoned auto repair shop on 47th Street. The man who stepped out was his uncle, Salvatore Castellano, who had spent nearly a year trying to find him. His uncle didn't ask what Caspian wanted. 3 days later, he was in Palermo. He never had the chance to return to that alley even once. He didn't get to tell her that he was leaving, didn't get to thank her, didn't get to say anything at all. On Thursday night that week, the bakery's back door was still open, and he was already more than 4,300 miles away. 10 years later, in the spring of 2013, Caspian returned to Chicago at the age of 26, carrying Salvatore's signed authorization and decision-making authority over 4 branches of the family's business. The first thing he did after the plane landed wasn't meet with the council. He told the driver to go straight down to back of the yards, to the row of red brick buildings on 47th Street, and he got out half a block away so he could walk the final stretch. The bakery was closed. A notice had been taped to the front window, soaked by rain, half the lettering blurred beyond recognition. Everything inside had already been cleared out and piled along the sidewalk, propped on a few pallets, waiting for the city garbage truck to collect it the following morning. There were 2 shelves with broken legs, a stack of dented steel trays, several chairs, and a cardboard box with the bottom torn open, lying on its side. He asked the man who was taking down the sign above the storefront. The man said the bakery had closed 3 weeks earlier, that he had no idea where the former owner had gone, and that he had only been hired to remove the sign. Caspian stood in front of that pile for a long time. Then he bent down. He turned over each item one by one, without rushing, and found it near the bottom of the torn cardboard box, lying face down among sheets of wrapping paper that had gone moldy. A wooden cake board, roughly 12 inches across, its upper surface scarred white by knife marks. He turned it over. 3 lines of icing had hardened long ago and faded to an ivory color, but the shapes were still intact. 3 stalks of barley standing side by side, tiny grains running along each stem. He stood up with the piece of wood in his hand and didn't take anything else from the pile. That was the last time he saw that mark. That evening, he called Nicholas Ferraro, who had been with Salvatore since before Caspian was born, and gave him the first assignment of his tenure. Find the woman who used to own that bakery. Her name was Vera, last name unknown, around 67 years old. Nico asked why he wanted to find her. Caspian said they would decide that after she was found. 3 weeks later, Nico placed a thin file on his desk. Inside was a copy of a death certificate. Nico said the bakery had lost its lease. The old woman had moved away, and she had died not long afterward. He said he had checked 3 different places, and this was the only record still on file. Caspian read the paper exactly once. He didn't ask Nico another question, didn't request the original, and didn't send a second person to verify it. He was 26 years old, had just taken control of an organization with 3 branches opposing him, and Salvatore had taught him that some things were only allowed to hurt once before they had to be put away. He took the wooden cake board upstairs to the 2nd floor of the Lake Forest house, placed it inside the room at the end of the east corridor, and locked the door. Over the next 12 years, he didn't open that door once. The household staff turned over 4 times. No one knew what was inside, and no one asked. That Monday morning, after leaving the library, Caspian called Nico in. He handed him a piece of paper with the words, "Back of the Yards," and a name written on it. "Reopen the 2013 file," he said. "Everything. Where is the original death certificate? Who issued it? Who kept it on record? Burial records. Property records for the bakery location. If she had relatives, I want a list." Nico stood there with both hands in his pockets. "You already got your answer," he said. "That was settled 12 years ago. I got a piece of paper," Caspian replied. "Not an answer." Nico looked at him for a moment, then asked whether this had anything to do with Friday night at the restaurant, because the entire city was talking about how he had paid $50,000 for a cake. Caspian said he wanted the records within a week. Nico said all right, and walked out. That afternoon, in his own office, Nico sat down, opened his laptop, and typed into the internal search field. He entered the first 4 letters of the name, then his hand stopped over the keyboard. 3 seconds. Then he erased everything and started again from the beginning. At 7 o'clock that evening, Nico's phone rang. Richard Vaughn didn't waste time. He said his daughter was still crying. His 3 contracts were hanging in limbo, and he wanted to know what was going on with the man he had been doing business with for 7 years. Nico told him to stay calm. "He's distracted," Nico said. "Old business." Vaughn asked how old. Nico said older than the time you and I have been doing business together. Vaughn was silent for a moment, then asked whether this distraction was likely to last. Nico said he didn't know, but a distracted man usually looked in one direction and failed to look in the other, and in business, that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Vaughn gave a short laugh over the phone. He said he only needed 3 more weeks. Nico said he would try to keep everything exactly where it was, then ended the call and remained seated in front of the open laptop screen, with the fully typed name resting silently in the search box, and his finger still hadn't pressed the button. That Thursday, Delia Wren came downstairs to find Elsa just before noon and told her the owner had a private order request, outside her regular working hours, and that she would be paid whatever price she quoted. Elsa asked what kind of cake. Delia handed her a piece of paper folded in half and said she didn't understand it either, that he had dictated it, and she had written it down exactly as he said it. There were 3 lines on the paper, honey-colored, 7 thin layers. Leaves the tongue slightly numb after eating. Elsa finished reading and stood still for a moment. "I can make it," she said. Delia asked whether she needed him to explain more clearly. "No," Elsa replied. "There aren't many cakes like that." The following afternoon, she received permission to use the estate's secondary kitchen after her shift ended, and Delia stood in the kitchen doorway for nearly 2 hours without ever saying what she was standing there for. Elsa cooked honey with butter and a little baking soda until the mixture foamed up, then settled back down into a deep amber color. She rolled 7 sheets of dough so thin that when she lifted one, she could see the shadow of her hand beneath it. Baked each sheet for exactly 4 minutes, stacked them with layers of sour cream filling in between, then wrapped the cake and placed it in the refrigerator overnight, because this kind of cake had to rest for a full night so the layers could absorb moisture and soften. If you ate it right away, it was hard and tasteless. Delia asked why she hadn't asked him the name of the cake. Elsa said that if he had wanted to say the name, he would have said it. On Friday evening, the cake was brought to the small dining room on the first floor. Elsa carried it upstairs and intended to set it down and leave, but Caspian told her to stay. He sat down, cut off a bite with his fork, and ate it. He didn't say anything while he chewed. When he finished that bite, he placed the fork against the edge of the plate and sat perfectly still. Elsa stood about 2 steps away from the table, both hands folded in front of her, and she counted more than a full minute. He wasn't looking at the cake. He wasn't looking at her either. He was staring down at the empty stretch of tabletop in front of him, with the exact expression of someone who had just heard a familiar sound inside a house he knew for certain was empty. Delia stood in the doorway, and at some point, she had carried the tray of water all the way up there, though Elsa hadn't noticed when, but she didn't step inside. She had worked in this house for 11 years. She had seen him sit in rooms with people who no longer had their jobs the next morning. She had never seen him like this. At last, Caspian spoke. "Something's missing," he said. Elsa nodded immediately, without taking offense, and without asking him to explain. "Lemon zest," she said. "My grandmother used to grate it into the cream at the very end, after everything was already whipped. She said if you grated it too early, the scent disappeared. I ran out of lemons. I went to the store on the corner, but they had closed early, and I didn't want to make the cake wait another night." Caspian was still looking down at the table. "She used to run out of lemons too," he said. The sentence fell between them, and neither of them reached for it. Elsa heard every word clearly. Something inside her mind had just clicked into place, fast and precise, like the sound of a lock catching. And immediately she understood that if she asked even one more question, she would have to explain why she had told him on Monday morning that she didn't know anyone in back of the yards. She remained exactly where she was. Caspian didn't continue either. He had heard himself say the words, and he had also realized that the woman standing 2 steps away from him had heard them. He didn't ask who her grandmother was. He had asked her a similar question on Monday morning, and she had answered no, and he was the kind of man who didn't ask the same question twice after it had been refused. The two of them remained silent for longer than silence normally lasted in a room with 2 people. Outside the doorway, Delia set the tray of water down on a side table, very quietly, then withdrew. Finally, Caspian stood. "Write up an invoice and give it to Mrs. Wren," he said. "Your price, not the price you think I want to hear." "Yes, sir." He reached the doorway, then stopped with one hand resting against the frame, and for 2 seconds Elsa thought he was going to turn around and ask. He didn't. "Take the rest of the cake downstairs for everyone in the kitchen," he said. "Don't leave it in the refrigerator." Then he walked away. Elsa remained alone in the dining room, with 6/7 of the cake still untouched. She looked down at the place where he had cut his piece, where the 7 layers of dough lay stacked one over another as thin as paper, and she reached for the edge of the table to steady herself. Out in the hallway, the sound of his footsteps gradually faded into the distance, even and measured, no faster than they ever were. The following Monday morning, Delia Wren called Elsa into the small office on the first floor, and Caspian was already sitting there. There was a printed sheet of paper on the desk. "Mrs. Wren will explain the terms to you," he said. "Starting at the beginning of the month, you'll be transferred to the kitchen department. No more cleaning shifts. Your hourly wage will be tripled, effective from the date you sign." Delia skimmed the page, then had to read the number on the 4th line a second time to make sure she hadn't seen it wrong. Elsa didn't pick up the paper. She stood there with both hands resting in front of her stomach, as she always did, and she looked down at the desk for about 3 seconds. "I'd like to decline," she said. Delia turned sharply toward her. Caspian's expression didn't change. "Why?" he asked. Elsa drew in a breath. "I came into this house in March to work cleaning shifts, and there are 11 other people in this house who work shifts just like mine. Some have been here 8 years, some have been here 10. None of them have been transferred to another department, and none of them have had their pay tripled. If you change my job because of that cake, then the other 11 people in this house are going to think I got it because of something else, and I'll have no way to prove they're wrong." Delia opened her mouth as though she were about to say something, then stopped. Caspian looked at Elsa. He looked at her for a very long time, long enough that Delia began to feel a chill along her spine. Because in 11 years she had learned that when he went this quiet, it usually meant someone was about to leave the house. Elsa didn't lower her eyes. She didn't add another word to soften what she had just said. She simply stood there and waited. At last, Caspian reached for the paper on the desk, folded it in half, and placed it face down. "Mrs. Wren," he said. "Yes, sir. Get me a list of every employee in this house. Everyone. Hourly staff, gardeners, both people in the garage. Include how many years they've worked here and their current pay. I want it before 4 o'clock this afternoon." Delia said yes, and she didn't ask why. At 4:15 that afternoon, she brought the list upstairs. Caspian read through the entire thing in about 7 minutes, without asking a single question, then picked up a pen. He changed each line one by one. He did it slowly, and he went through both pages. When he finished, he pushed the paper back toward her. "Starting next month, every employee in this house gets a raise," he said. "Anyone who's been here less than 3 years gets 20%. Anyone who's been here more than 5 years gets 35. Anyone who's been here more than 10 years gets 50. Delia looked down at the page. "One more thing," he said. "Everyone currently working by the hour moves to a formal, full-time contract, with health insurance for themselves and their dependents. The house will cover the employee contribution. Work with human resources. I want the paperwork submitted this week." Delia stood still. She held the paper in both hands, and for a moment she couldn't speak. "Sir," she said after a while, "there are 11 people. Do you know what that will cost in a year?" "I just wrote the number down myself," he replied. "Then, Mrs. Wren." He stood up. "I've decided. Go take care of it." He walked out of the room, and he didn't say another word to Elsa. Didn't look in her direction even once. Didn't give any sign at all of why he had just done what he had done. The door closed behind him. Only the 2 women remained in the room. Delia was still holding the paper. She read it again from the beginning, and when she reached the line with the name of the kitchen worker's husband, her hands began to tremble. "Do you know Marta?" she asked. Elsa said she did. That Marta worked the morning shift in the main kitchen. "Her husband has diabetes," Delia said. "The two of them have been buying private insurance on their own for 4 years, almost $1,100 every month. I submitted this proposal in 2016, 2019, and 2022. 3 times. Not once did I get an answer." Elsa didn't know what to say. Delia looked up, and her eyes were red. "You just accomplished something I've been asking for 11 years, she said. "I didn't do anything," Elsa replied. "I just said no." Delia shook her head and didn't argue. She folded the paper, slipped it into her folder, and before leaving, she stopped at the door. "You're keeping your cleaning shift," she said. "Yes. And your pay goes up 20%, the same as everyone who's been here less than 3 years. Not $1 more." "Yes," Elsa said. "That's right." Delia looked at her for another moment, then left. At 4:40 that afternoon, Elsa was still pushing her cleaning cart down the east corridor just as she did every day. And when she reached the final door, she stopped, turned the cart around, and went downstairs. The letter from Rosewood arrived on Wednesday by certified mail, and Elsa signed for it at the door. This time it wasn't a phone call. This time it was in writing, with the director of nursing's signature at the bottom, and on the second line they stated it plainly. 21 days. Vera Kowalczyk's condition had progressed to the point where she now required 24-hour supervision, overnight staff, full assistance with meals, and fall prevention care. Rosewood didn't have a unit equipped to provide that level of care. Within 21 days, the family would have to arrange for her transfer to a qualified facility. On the second page, they listed 3 places within a 25-mile radius. The least expensive of the 3 cost $9,400 a month. Elsa took out her phone and opened the spreadsheet she had created the day she received the check. The one she had reviewed so many times that she knew every number by heart. That $50,000 had never really been $50,000. The accountant at the tax preparation service had explained that it was business income, not a gift, because there was an invoice signed by both parties, which meant she had to pay federal income tax, Illinois state tax, and self-employment tax. Altogether, it came to roughly $15,000, and she had already moved that amount into a separate account so she would never spend it by mistake. $14,200 had gone toward paying Rosewood's old balance in full during the first week. She had prepaid 6 months of care at the old rate. She had replaced the oven and bought a new refrigerated cabinet because the seal on the old mini refrigerator had failed and she couldn't accept larger orders with it. $4,100 remained. $9,400 a month meant $4,100 wouldn't cover even 2 weeks. She sat on that stairwell for a long time, and the worst part wasn't the number. The worst part was that she had held more money in her hands than she ever had at any other point in her life, had done everything right with it, and somehow she was still standing in exactly the same place. On Friday, a woman sent a message to Elsa's baking page. Adrian Pike. Elsa knew the name. Everyone knew the name. She had a weekend baking program and 2 books that had sold hundreds of thousands of copies. She asked Elsa to meet her at a coffee shop near the West Loop, and she arrived on time, alone, with no one accompanying her. She said she had seen the clip. Elsa said she knew there was a clip, but she hadn't watched it. The video Sabrina Vaughn posted that night had been recorded before Caspian entered the room, so he wasn't in it. The check wasn't in it. There was nothing except a woman in a maid's uniform, standing beside a 4-tier cake, and a voice off camera saying it looked homemade. Sabrina had posted it to make people laugh. The people watching didn't laugh. Within 3 days, it had been shared more than 2 million times, and most of the comments were about the same thing, that people had noticed the uniform before they noticed the cake. Adrian Pike set her phone down on the table and said she wasn't interested in the fact that the video had gone viral. She was interested in the technique. She said she had enlarged the frame at the 19th second and seen that the 4-tier cake didn't contain a single plastic dowel, and she wanted to know where Elsa had learned to do that. Elsa said her grandmother had taught her. Adrian asked whether her grandmother had written any of it down. Elsa was silent a little too long before saying there was a notebook. Adrian Pike nodded, then made her offer in a perfectly ordinary voice, as though this were something she did every month, which perhaps it was. $30,000, paid once, transferred within 7 business days. She would purchase the complete rights to every piece of content in the notebook. She would edit it, photograph it, and publish it as part of her next book series. The author's name on the cover would be hers. Elsa would sign a clause agreeing never to claim authorship of those recipes, and never to use them commercially under her own name. Adrian explained everything clearly. She hid nothing in the wording, and she pushed the contract across the table so Elsa could read it herself. "This is legal," she said. "You can have a lawyer look at it. I'm not rushing you, but I'm going to tell you something truthfully, and you may hate me for saying it. If you don't sell it, then 10 years from now, that notebook will still be sitting in a drawer in your home, and no one will know those recipes ever existed. If you do sell it, they'll be in the kitchens of 200,000 people." Elsa took the contract home. She sat in front of it all Saturday night at the folding table pushed against the window, reading it from beginning to end 4 times, and she couldn't find a single trap hidden in the language. There wasn't one. That was exactly what made it difficult. Close to 4 o'clock in the morning, she took the faded cloth-bound notebook from the bottom drawer. She didn't open it to the recipes. She turned directly to the final page, the only page in the entire notebook where the handwriting trembled and the letters leaned toward the right. Written sometime in 2019, when her grandmother could still hold a pen by herself but had already begun forgetting who she was writing to. "If you ever have to sell the cakes. Don't sell my name." Elsa closed the notebook. She sat completely still for a very long time. Then she pulled the contract toward herself, turned to the page with the line for her signature, and picked up the pen. The signing was scheduled for 10 o'clock Monday morning at the same coffee shop. Adrian Pike arrived first, carrying 2 printed copies of the contract, with an attorney seated 2 tables away. Elsa placed the cloth-bound notebook on the table beside the contract and rested one hand on it. Adrian had just uncapped her pen when someone pulled out the empty chair beside them and sat down. Caspian didn't greet anyone. He didn't look at Elsa. He placed a double-sided printed sheet in front of Adrian Pike and pushed it toward her with 2 fingers. "Read the first page," he said. Adrian picked it up. She had been reading for about 10 seconds when her expression changed. It was a supplier directory for the chain of 40 restaurants bearing her brand, the franchise operation she had signed onto 2 years earlier and was preparing to expand by another 12 locations. 3 lines had been marked: flour and yeast, the sole distributor in the Midwest; refrigerated transportation, and the supplier of commercial kitchen equipment for all the new locations. The second page showed the ownership structure of all 3 companies, and all 3 led back to the same parent entity. Adrian Pike set the paper down. She was an intelligent woman, and she didn't ask a foolish question. "What are you telling me?" she asked. "I'm not telling you anything," Caspian replied. "I'm showing you a piece of paper. These are public records. You can verify them yourself. I only put them together so you wouldn't have to waste the time." She looked at him. "My contract with Miss Doyle is legal." "I know," he said. "I had someone read it. It's legal, and it's cheap." Adrian was silent for about 5 seconds. Then she folded both copies of her contract, put them into her briefcase, stood up, and before leaving, she told Elsa that her offer would remain open for 30 days if she changed her mind, and there was no sarcasm in her voice when she said it. Then she left. Elsa remained still until the coffee shop door closed behind the attorney. Then she turned toward Caspian. "You just took $30,000 away from my grandmother," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it trembled. "Do you know what 21 days means? It means that in 3 weeks they're going to move my grandmother, and I don't get to choose where she goes. They choose for me. Wherever there's an open bed, that's where she goes. $30,000 is more than 3 months. 3 months for me to find another way. You just took those 3 months out of my hands without asking me a single question." Caspian listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt, didn't explain himself, and when she finished, he didn't answer immediately. He reached for the cloth-bound notebook on the table, held it in both hands for a moment, then pushed it back toward her. "I'm not buying it." She said nothing. "Because this notebook shouldn't leave your family," he said. "Then what am I supposed to use to pay for her care?" Elsa asked. "Work." He reached inside his jacket and took out another set of papers, much thicker this time, bound at the spine, and placed it in front of her. "I recently bought back the old property on 47th Street in back of the yards, along with the vacant lot beside it, just over 2,100 square feet. I'm proposing that we rebuild and open a bakery there. You would be the head baker and the operator. You decide the entire product line, pricing, and hiring. I provide the initial capital, renovation costs, equipment, and the first 6 months of operating expenses. In return, I keep 49% of the company. You keep 51%. Elsa looked at the papers without touching them. "I don't have anything to contribute," she said. "You contribute what you're holding in your hand," he replied, pointing toward the notebook without touching it. "It will be independently valued and recorded as your capital contribution, in writing, by a third party. The notebook remains yours." The company only has the right to use its contents within the scope of the business. When the agreement ends, that right ends with it. He turned to page 11 and rotated the document toward her. Your salary is the salary of a head baker, paid monthly, beginning in the first month, whether the bakery makes a profit or not. At that amount, you can pay $9,400 a month for her care and still have enough left to live on. If the bakery loses money, I absorb my share of the loss according to my ownership percentage. If it makes money, you receive the larger share. The books are handled by an independent accounting firm. I don't appoint them. You choose from the 3 firms listed on the final page. This isn't a gift. You owe me 49%, and you'll have to work to earn your side of it. Elsa read. She read for a very long time, and Caspian remained silent the entire time, never rushing her, never adding another word to persuade her. At last, she looked up. What's your condition? She asked. One condition, he said. You don't make anyone else's cakes. No franchising, no taking orders from someone else's design, and no giving the recipes in that notebook to anyone else to put their name on. You make only your cakes. Elsa rested her hand on the contract. I need time to read this carefully, she said, and I'm going to have someone else look at it. He stood up. I hope you do, he said. The 3 firms are on the last page. Call them directly. Don't go through me. Then he walked out, and he didn't say a single word about her grandmother. 3 days later, Elsa brought the contract back to the estate after having a lawyer review it. She said she agreed, and she asked for 2 small revisions concerning the termination period. Caspian said that was fine. Then, just as she was getting to her feet, he asked one more question. I'd like to send flowers to your grandmother, he said. Tell me which cemetery she's in. Elsa stopped halfway through, reaching for her bag. She didn't answer. 1 second passed, then 2, then 5, and she was still standing there without saying anything. Her eyes lowered toward the edge of the table. Caspian looked at her. He didn't ask again. He said, All right, we can leave that for later. And he let her go. That afternoon, he remained alone and did something he should have done 12 years earlier. He searched. He didn't ask Nico. He opened the Cook County Vital Records database himself, typed in the name Vera Kowalczyk, and searched the burial records. Nothing. He expanded the search to 3 neighboring counties. Nothing. He searched the cemetery directory of the Archdiocese of Chicago, which kept Catholic burial records dating back to 1970. Nothing. 40 minutes. And nowhere in the entire state of Illinois was there a grave under that name. He sat motionless in front of the screen. Then he changed the direction of the search. He entered the name into the public database for Illinois Medicaid, under the list of applications currently undergoing asset review, and found it immediately on the second line. Vera Kowalczyk, born in 1946. Application submitted in February. Status pending. Current residence, Rosewood Memory Care, Evanston. He stared at those words for a very long time. Then he stood up, and he didn't call the driver. He drove himself. Rosewood was a 2-story building set back behind a lawn, and the memory care unit was on the 2nd floor, at the end of the west corridor, beyond a coded door. He didn't ask to go inside. He only told the person at the desk that he was gathering information for a relative, and they allowed him to walk along the outer corridor, where a row of large glass panels looked into the common area. He moved slowly along the glass. Room 214 was near the middle. The door stood slightly open, and through the gap, he could see inside. An elderly woman sat in an armchair beside the window, her body leaning faintly toward the light, both hands resting in her lap. She wasn't watching television. She wasn't looking outside. The thumb and forefinger of her right hand were pressed lightly together, moving steadily through the air from left to right, and then circling back again, in the unmistakable rhythm of someone piping icing onto the surface of a cake. Caspian stopped. He didn't take another step. He stood there looking into the room for several seconds, then turned away, walked 3 paces until he was out of sight of the doorway, and leaned his back against the hallway wall. He raised one hand and covered his mouth. Then his knees gave way. His back slid down the wall, and he sank to the floor of the nursing home corridor. The man whom no one had seen lose his balance even once in 22 years. He sat there for a long time. A caregiver passing by stopped and asked whether he was all right. He shook his head. She remained there for another moment, then continued on. He didn't cry aloud. His shoulders didn't move. He simply sat with one hand covering his mouth, his eyes fixed on the wall across from him, and he remained that way until the sound of footsteps stopped at the far end of the corridor. Elsa stood there, still holding the paper bag of things she had brought for her grandmother. Delia had texted her that the owner had asked for the address of Rosewood, and Elsa had taken a cab immediately, and all the way there, She had thought of perhaps 10 different ways to begin. Now, seeing him sitting on the floor, all 10 disappeared. She walked over, set the bag down, and crouched about 3 feet away from him. "My grandmother is still alive," she said. "She's just not really in there anymore." Caspian lowered his hand. He didn't look at her. "Since when?" he asked, his voice rough. "There were signs in 2018. The official diagnosis came in 2019. By 2023, she didn't remember my name anymore. She still remembers my mother, but my mother has been gone for years. So every time she asks, I have to tell her Mom is at work." Elsa looked down at her hands. "When people ask whether I have any family, I say I don't have anyone left. When they ask where my grandmother is, I say she's gone. I say it because then people stop asking. If I tell the truth, I have to keep explaining, and I can't do that." Caspian said nothing. "My grandmother lost everything," Elsa said. "She forgot the bakery, forgot the customers, forgot even my name. But every day she still sits there and makes that motion, the one no one ever sees." She paused for a moment. "It turns out the part no one sees is the last part that stays," she said. Caspian turned his head and looked at her for the first time since she arrived. "Let me see her," he said. Elsa said tomorrow. She explained that her grandmother was most tired in the afternoons, and if they went in now, she would become frightened. She said she would bring something with her. Caspian didn't ask what. The next morning, he was in the Rosewood parking lot at 9 o'clock. Elsa arrived 10 minutes later, carrying a small paper box. Inside was a honey cake about 6 inches across, 7 layers, made the night before, and warmed gently before she left home so it was still slightly warm. This time, she had added the lemon zest. The two of them went up to the second floor. The nurse opened the coated door and told them to speak slowly. Stay within Vera's line of sight, and never stand behind her. Room 214 had 1 bed, 1 nightstand, and an armchair positioned beside the window. Vera was sitting there with both hands resting in her lap. Elsa went in first. "Grandma, it's me." Vera turned. She looked at Elsa and smiled the polite smile she now gave everyone. Caspian stepped inside and stopped about 2 paces from the chair. Elsa said, "Grandma, someone came to visit you." Vera looked at him. Her eyes traveled once across his face without stopping anywhere. "Hello, young man," she said politely, in the voice of someone greeting a stranger. Caspian told her his name. Vera nodded as though she had just heard a name that meant nothing to her at all. Then she turned back toward the window. Elsa set the paper box on the small table beside the chair and opened the lid. No one said anything for about 5 seconds. Then Vera lifted her head slightly. She didn't look toward the box. She simply raised her head and drew in 1 very slow breath, and the polite expression disappeared from her face. She turned around. This time she looked directly at Caspian, and the way she looked at him was entirely different from before. "You're late, Thursday." She said it in an ordinary voice. No surprise, no emotion. The voice of a woman who had just looked up from a steel work table and found the boy standing in the doorway about half an hour later than he usually came each week. Caspian couldn't speak. He stood there with one hand still hanging at his side, and he couldn't get a single word out. Vera lifted her hand and beckoned to him. "Come here." He took 2 steps forward. She reached for his right hand, pulled it down, and turned his palm upward. She looked at it. She looked for a long time, in exactly the way someone examines something they have examined many times before, then ran her thumb lightly across his fingertips. "Have you eaten?" Caspian opened his mouth. It took him a moment before he could make any sound. "Yes, ma'am." Vera nodded. She patted the back of his hand twice, gently, then let go. "Sit down," she said. "Why are you standing there?" Caspian sat on the edge of the bed, about 3 feet away from her. Elsa cut a small piece of cake, placed it on a plate, and handed it to her. Vera took it, ate half, then rested the plate in her lap. She looked out the window. No one spoke. Caspian sat there watching her hands, the joints now enlarged with age and arthritis, the fingernails neatly trimmed by someone else. He didn't ask her anything. He didn't say a word about the 22 years. He simply sat. 3 minutes passed, perhaps a little more than 3. Vera handed the plate back to Elsa. Then she leaned slightly toward her and lowered her voice the way people do when asking something delicate in front of a guest. "Sweetheart, who is that man?" Elsa hadn't prepared for that question. She had prepared for almost everything else, but not for it to come so quickly. "He's someone I know, Grandma," she said. Vera nodded. "He looks kind." Then she turned back toward the window and placed both hands in her lap again. Caspian stood up. He did it very slowly, without any sudden movement. "I should go," he said, and Vera replied, "All right, take care," in the polite voice she used for strangers. He walked out the door. He made it about 4 steps down the hallway before he stopped. He didn't continue. He turned toward the wall on his right and stood facing it, one hand braced against the wall at shoulder height, his head slightly bowed. He stayed that way. No one passed through that stretch of hallway for the next few minutes. Elsa remained in the room a little longer. She closed the cake box, placed what was left on the nightstand, and wrote Vera's name on the lid with a marker as she always did. Because if she didn't write the name, the caregivers wouldn't know who it belonged to. Vera asked what day it was. Elsa said Saturday. Vera said, "All right." Then Elsa kissed her forehead and told her she would come back tomorrow. When Elsa stepped into the hallway, Caspian had already taken his hand away from the wall. He stood straight, turned around, and his face had returned to normal, completely normal, with no trace of anything left on it. Only his eyes were red. 9,400 a month, he said. Elsa nodded. "She's not being moved just anywhere," he said. "I'll speak with this place today. If they don't have the level of care she needs, I'll find one that does, and I'll ask you before I choose." Elsa was about to say she couldn't accept that. She had been ready to say it from the moment he started speaking, but she looked at him, and she understood that this time he wasn't doing it for her. That night, Caspian returned to Lake Forest and went straight upstairs to the east corridor. He opened the final door for the first time in 12 years. There was nothing inside except a table and the wooden cake board resting face up on it. The 3 dried lines of icing long since faded to ivory. Beside it lay the thin file Nico had given him in 2013. Caspian carried the file down to the library, turned on the light, and this time he read the death certificate the way he should have read it 12 years earlier. First line, full name, Wera Kowalczyk, not Vera, not Kowalczyk. 1 letter wrong in the first name, 1 letter missing from the last. Second line, date of birth, 1942. 4 years off. The final residential address listed a street in Cicero that he traced in less than 2 minutes, about 7 miles from back of the yards, and the woman who bore that name had lived there from 1978 until the day she died, had 3 children, and had never worked a single day as a baker in her life. 40 minutes. That was all the time he needed. On Monday morning, Nico Ferraro arrived at the estate for the weekly briefing, just as he had done for the past 20 years. Caspian was already seated. On the table between them lay exactly 1 sheet of paper, face down. Caspian turned it over and pushed it toward Nico with 2 fingers. "You searched for 3 weeks, he said. "I searched for 40 minutes. Nico looked at the page. He didn't pick it up. He sat motionless for about 5 seconds, then leaned back in his chair and let out a breath. The kind of breath a man takes when he has finally set down something heavy he has carried for far too long. "She's still alive, isn't she?" Nico said. Caspian didn't answer. Nico nodded to himself. "Salvatore gave the order," he said. 3 days after you assigned me the search. I found her during the first week. She had moved in with her daughter, less than 1.25 miles from the old bakery. I had the address. I had the phone number. I stood across the street and watched her hanging towels on the balcony. I went back and reported to Salvatore before I reported to you, because back then I still reported to him first. That was how we had worked for 18 years. He paused. When he heard it, he asked me who the old woman was to you. I told him what I knew. He sat there for a very long time. Then he said 1 sentence to me, and I remember it word for word even now. He said, "A boss can't have a back door someone can knock on. That old woman was your back door." Nico looked up. 3 weeks later, I brought you that paper. I took it from the real file of a real woman in Cicero. I only changed 2 letters. I knew you wouldn't check. Caspian said nothing. He sat perfectly still, both hands resting on the table, and he never raised his voice. "My uncle has been dead for 9 years, he said. "Why did you keep the lie alive for another 9? Nico was silent for a moment. "Because it worked," he said. "Look at you. You came back here at 26 with 3 branches moving against you, and no one believed you would survive the winter. Now you sit at the head of the table, and no one dares contradict you by a single word. What do you think made that possible? It wasn't wisdom. It was because you had nothing to lose. Because every time you made a decision, there was no one in your head you had to think about. If I had given you that address in 2013, you would have become a different man, and that man wouldn't have kept this chair." Caspian looked at him for a very long time. Then he told him to leave. Nico stood and walked out, and he didn't apologize once, nor did he say anything more. Caspian didn't sleep that night. He wasn't thinking about Salvatore. He was thinking about one small detail Nico had let slip, that he had still been reporting to Salvatore before reporting to Caspian, and Caspian found himself wondering exactly when that habit had ended. The next morning, he called an auditing firm in New York, not the firm that normally handled the family's accounts, and instructed them to review every movement of money across all 4 business branches, dating back to 2016. 11 days later, they sent their findings. There was a fixed management fee equal to 6% of revenue, established in the second month after Salvatore's death, moving through a chain of 4 consulting companies before ending in 3 real estate investment funds registered in Delaware. The authorized Castellano signatory on all 4 companies was Nicholas Ferraro. The person listed as controlling all 3 funds at the other end was Richard Vaughn. 9 years. The total amount exceeded $22 million. Caspian read the entire report, closed it, and didn't call either man for the next 2 days. On the 3rd day, Nico moved first. Thursday morning, when Caspian opened the safe in the library to retrieve the insurance documents he needed to take to his attorney, the top compartment was empty. The Patek Philippe Salvatore had left him. A custom-made piece insured at $1,900,000 was gone. He called Delia upstairs. Delia called security. By 11 o'clock that morning, the file was complete enough that no one needed to ask another question. The electronic access log for the 2nd floor recorded a card swipe into the library at 11:04 on Tuesday morning, outside the normal schedule, and the card identification number belonged to Elsa Doyle. The camera in the east corridor showed someone wearing a maid's uniform entering the room and coming back out 4 minutes later. Her back turned toward the camera, her hair tied up, her build consistent with Elsa's. The technical team lifted fingerprints from the door handle and the front of the safe, and they found her prints in both places, clear and recent. Delia immediately said that Elsa cleaned that door every day, that the safe itself was included in the weekly cleaning schedule, and the security officer told her that was true, and that was precisely why the fingerprints couldn't rule anyone in or out. By that afternoon, the file had been turned over to the police. The detective assigned to the case was Frank Halloran of the Chicago Police Department, 50 years old, 22 years on the force, and a man who had been watching the Castellano name since his days in the homicide division. He finished reviewing the file in 40 minutes. In 22 years, this was the first case he had ever seen in which every piece of evidence had been voluntarily submitted by the Castellano household itself. He requested a warrant, and the court approved it Friday morning. At 10:20 on Friday morning, 3 cars pulled up outside the gates of the Lake Forest estate. Elsa was helping the staff in the secondary kitchen, after finishing her morning cleaning rounds, preparing food for the lunch shift. She hadn't even taken off her apron when Delia came in first. Her face drained of color, with Halloran and 2 plainclothes officers behind her. Halloran asked which one of them was Elsa Doyle. Elsa set the knife down on the cutting board. "I am," she said. He read her full name, read the warrant number, and told her she was under arrest for theft of property valued at more than $1 million under Illinois criminal law. He read her rights. He read them slowly and clearly, exactly as procedure required, and he didn't raise his voice once. Delia screamed. She shouted that Elsa hadn't done it, that she had worked in this house for 11 years, and she knew Elsa wouldn't do something like that Elsa cleaned that door every day and everyone knew it. One of the officers extended an arm to stop her from coming closer. Marta abandoned the pot she had been tending in the main kitchen and ran into the hallway to call the others. There were 6 people in the kitchen, and not one of them could say a word except Delia. Elsa said nothing. She didn't argue. She didn't ask why. She took off her apron, folded it, and placed it on the steel table beside the cutting board. And she did it neatly, exactly the way she did at the end of every shift. Then she held both hands out in front of her. There was a brief metallic sound. They led her out of the kitchen and into the hallway. And at that exact moment, Caspian appeared at the far end, coming down from the direction of the library. He stopped about 23 feet away. Elsa looked at him. She didn't beg with her eyes. She didn't call his name. She simply looked at him. And there was only one question in that look, a question she never spoke aloud. Caspian stood still. He didn't step forward. He didn't say a word to Halloran. He didn't call an attorney, didn't reach for his phone, didn't signal to anyone in the house. He stood there with both arms at his sides, looking back at her, and he did nothing. Halloran watched the 2 of them for about 2 seconds, and he made note of it, because it was the one detail he hadn't expected. He had prepared himself for every possible situation before walking into this house that morning, including the worst one. But he had never prepared for Caspian Castellano to simply stand there. They led Elsa down the hallway, through the foyer, and out the front door. Delia followed as far as the steps before someone held her back. She stood there and called Elsa's name twice. Elsa didn't turn around. She walked down the steps, bent into the back seat of the first car, and the door closed behind her. The 3 cars left the estate gates at 10:35. Caspian was still standing in the same place in the hallway. He remained there long after the sound of the cars had completely disappeared down the road. Delia came back inside walked straight up to him, and she was the only person in that house who dared to speak. "You didn't say anything," she said. Her voice trembled. "You stood there and didn't say a single word." Caspian didn't answer her. He looked toward the closed door, and only after a long moment did he turn and walk back upstairs toward the library, closing the door behind him. What Delia didn't know, and what no one else in that house knew, was that Caspian had already weighed two possibilities in the roughly 7 seconds he stood in that hallway. He could have stopped Halloran right there. He had lawyers. He had connections. He had enough ways to make sure that morning ended without a single car leaving the gates. But if he did that, the case would never be closed by an official decision from the prosecution. It would only stop. And a case that merely stops can be reopened for the rest of a person's life. Elsa would forever be the woman who had once been arrested for stealing a watch worth nearly $2 million and then released because a crime boss intervened. She would carry that with her into every rental application, every loan application, every business license, and every time someone typed her name into a search bar. He chose the second path, and the price of the second path was 26 hours. Illinois had eliminated cash bail in 2023, so there was no amount of money he could pay, and no way to shorten the process. Elsa was taken to the Cook County Jail on Friday afternoon, and her detention hearing was scheduled for Saturday morning. She signed forms, answered intake questions, and left the emergency contact section blank because she had no one to put there. Saturday morning, in courtroom number 4, not a single person sat in the gallery behind her. Meanwhile, beginning Friday afternoon, Caspian did 4 things. First, he gave Halloran all of the original, unprocessed data from the East Corridor camera system, not the extracted footage his own security team had already prepared. The department's technical unit compared the timestamps in the original files and discovered that footage from 11:02 to 11:03 and 31 seconds on Tuesday morning had been inserted from a different file, a total of 91 seconds, and the woman in the maid's uniform shown in that segment hadn't been recorded on Tuesday at all. Second, he submitted the complete technical documentation for the safe in the library, provided directly to the police by the company that installed it. The safe opened by fingerprint and personal code belonging to 3 people: Caspian, Nico Ferraro, and the head of security. An access card could open the room door, but it couldn't open the safe, and there was no way in the world for a cleaning staff card to open the top compartment. Third, he submitted a copy of the invoice and the $50,000 corporate check stub from Castellano Hospitality Group, complete with the date, time, and both signatures, along with bank records showing that the money had entered Elsa's account a few weeks earlier. The woman accused of stealing because she was desperate for money had paid every required tax on a legitimate payment worth more than an entire year of her wages, and she had used it to pay off her grandmother's medical debt. The motive disappeared. The 4th thing was the one none of his lawyers agreed with. He turned over the estate's entire internal surveillance system, with no limit on dates, no limit on areas, every original file from the past 4 years, along with read access. It contained images of every person who had walked through the doors of that house during those 4 years. Friday afternoon, Halloran sat in his office staring at the hard drive on his desk, and he asked Caspian directly, "You know I'm going to go through all of this, don't you?" "I know," Caspian replied. Halloran looked at him for a long time. Then he pulled the hard drive toward himself and said he would forward the case file to the prosecutor before 8 o'clock that evening. Saturday morning, at the detention hearing, the prosecutor moved to dismiss all charges because the evidence lacked sufficient foundation and showed signs of fabrication. The judge granted the motion, ordered Elsa released immediately, and sealed the record. At 11:20 on Saturday morning, Elsa walked out through the rear exit of the detention facility on California Avenue, holding the plastic bag containing her returned personal belongings. Caspian stood at the curb across the street. He had brought no one with him. There was no car waiting, no one holding an umbrella, nothing at all. He was simply standing there, and he had probably been there for quite some time. Elsa crossed the street. She walked straight up to him. She stopped about 1.5 feet away and looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. Then she slapped him. It was a hard slap, hard enough to snap his head to one side, and the sound of it carried clearly across the morning sidewalk. Caspian didn't dodge. He didn't raise a hand to his face either. He only turned his head back and looked at her. "You're fine," she said, and her voice broke on the 3rd word. "You stood there and looked at me and didn't say anything. Do you know that for the past 26 hours, I haven't been thinking about the watch? I haven't been thinking about jail? I've only been thinking about how you stood there and did nothing?" Caspian didn't defend himself. He didn't explain a single thing about the 4 things he had done, about the hard drive, about the 91 seconds, about why he had needed to let her go through that door. He said only one sentence. "Your record is clean," he said. "On paper. Permanently." Elsa stood still. Then she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, gripping the back of his coat tightly, burying her face against his shoulder. And she began to cry out loud right there on the sidewalk. Caspian didn't pull away from that either. He stood still, then very slowly lifted one hand and placed it against her back. The family council met on Tuesday evening the following week, in the great room at Lake Forest. 9 people seated around a long table. Caspian came alone. He brought no security, no one standing behind his chair, and he placed exactly one thing on the table, a stack of documents nearly the width of a hand, prepared by the auditing firm in New York. He gave no opening remarks. He read through it year by year, beginning with the 2nd month after Salvatore's death, naming the 4 consulting companies, reading the amount from every quarter, naming the person who had signed the authorization on one end and the person controlling the money on the other. He read for 20 straight minutes, and he didn't raise his voice once. By the time he reached the total, $22,400,000, no one in the room was sitting comfortably in their chair anymore. The oldest member of the council asked who had prepared the documents. Caspian gave the name of the firm, said he hadn't been an existing client of theirs, and said anyone in the room was free to hire another firm and have every number checked independently. No one asked for another audit. Nico Ferraro sat in the 3rd chair on the left. He didn't argue a single point. When Caspian finished reading, Nico only said that he had been part of this house for 31 years. Caspian said he knew. Then he announced his decision, and he did it in the same voice he normally used to ask what time it was. Nicholas Ferraro was stripped of every position, every share of profit, and every asset belonging to the family that remained under his control. The 4 consulting companies would be dissolved. Whatever money could still be recovered would be recovered. He could keep the house he lived in, and the money in his own personal accounts. Beyond that, nothing. No one would touch him. No one would hunt him down. And no one in any branch of any organization in the city would ever take his call again. Anyone who did would answer for that choice themselves. Nico sat still, then asked why Caspian was doing it that way. Caspian looked at him. "You once told me I wasn't allowed to have a back door," he said. "Now you're the one who doesn't have a door left." Nico stood and walked out of the room, and none of the other 8 people watched him leave. Richard Vaughn was simpler. Every business relationship was severed within 48 hours. 3 suppliers terminated their contracts at the same time, and 2 banks called in their financing. 10 days later, a package with no sender information arrived at the Chicago office of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. Inside were statements from the 3 investment funds registered in Delaware, along with a 9-year reconciliation of the transactions. By the end of the month, Vaughn's real estate group filed for bankruptcy protection. Sabrina Vaughn came to see Elsa one afternoon in June at the 47th Street property while it was still being renovated. She wasn't crying, and she didn't beg for anything. She stood in the doorway and said she had come to apologize. She said she had deleted the video, that she knew it had already spread too far for deleting it to matter, and that she was sorry for what she had said that night. Elsa listened to all of it. She wiped her hands on her apron and said she accepted the apology. Then she added one more thing. "But you're not apologizing to me because of the cake," Elsa said. "You're apologizing because you lost." There were 14 people in that room that night, and 3 servers stood against the wall for 2 hours. There was one waiter you called back 3 times because he poured your water too slowly. He was wearing a uniform too, just like I was. You don't remember his face, do you? Sabrina didn't answer. "When you feel guilty about what you did to that waiter too, come back," Elsa said. "Then I'll make you coffee." Sabrina remained there for another moment, then nodded and left. 3 weeks later, Caspian called the council together for a second meeting and announced something none of the 9 people present had expected. He was stepping away from direct operational control. Over the next 3 years, all family operations would be converted into 3 licensed businesses, with open books, the restaurant group, rental real estate, and refrigerated transportation. Any branch that couldn't be converted would be shut down. He said he had already signed contracts with a restructuring firm and a tax law firm, and he said he knew revenue would fall by at least half during those 3 years. The oldest member asked why he was doing this now. Caspian was silent for a moment. "Because I just lost 12 years to a piece of paper I didn't verify," he said. "I don't want to leave anyone a house where people have to lie to each other just to survive." The council voted. 6 in favor, 2 abstentions, 1 opposed. That night, Caspian drove from Lake Forest down to Evanston, went to Rosewood, and sat in the hallway outside room 214 until visiting hours were over. 3 years later, on a September morning in 2028, a bakery opened at 6 o'clock on the site of an old parking lot on 47th Street in back of the yards. There was only one word on the glass door: Vera's. The front half sold cakes and pastries, while the back half was a long kitchen with 2 rows of steel work tables. And every Saturday, 18 teenagers in the Illinois foster care system came there to learn a trade for free. The program charged nothing, had no admissions process, and required no diploma. Anyone who attended for 3 full months received a certificate, and anyone who wanted to stay and work was offered a paid position. Elsa Doyle was the head baker. Caspian Castellano stood behind the coffee counter with an apron tied around his waist. And in that bakery, no one called him boss anymore. Regular customers called him Cass, and the kids called him Uncle Cass. Near the end of the row of steel tables, Mia Brennan, 16 years old, was holding a utility knife and showing 2 younger kids how to cut a wooden cake support. "Don't rush," she said. "Don't force it. Just follow the line. If you ruin it, take another piece. We're not running out of wood here." One of the kids cut crooked, sighed, and Mia handed over another piece without saying anything else. Just inside the entrance stood a small glass display case. There were no cakes inside. There were 2 wooden cake boards, both displayed face up so their undersides could be seen. The first was worn and scarred white, with 3 hardened lines of icing faded to ivory underneath. The board Caspian had picked out of a pile waiting for the garbage truck one afternoon in 2013 and kept inside a locked room for 12 years. The second was newer, the base from that 4-tier birthday cake years ago, with its 3 stalks of barley still perfectly intact. Beneath the 2 wooden boards was a small brass plaque engraved with only 3 words: "Not for sale." Customers often stopped in front of the case and asked why the undersides were on display. The kids in the kitchen had grown used to answering. They said because that was the part most worth looking at. Near noon that day, an elderly woman pushed open the door carrying a cloth bag in her arms. She placed an old aluminum cake pan on the counter, rusted, bent at one corner, with one side of the handle broken off. She said it had belonged to her mother, that her mother had died in 1994, and that she had already taken it to 3 different places. "They told me to throw it away," she said. "They said it couldn't be used anymore, and buying a new one would cost less than repairing this." Elsa picked up the pan, turned it slowly in her hands, and tapped lightly against the side to hear the sound it made. "We don't throw things away," she said. She called Mia over, handed her the pan, and told her to straighten the bent corner, remove the rust, make a new handle, and take her time. "Don't finish it today." The elderly woman asked how much it would cost. Elsa told her to come back the following Saturday and bring a story about her mother to tell the kids. That would be enough. Outside the window, beneath the sunlight, Vera Kowalczyk sat in a wheelchair in the small courtyard beside the bakery. She was 82 years old. The care facility Caspian had found 3 years earlier was about 2.5 miles away, and every Saturday someone brought her over to spend the morning there. She didn't remember the name of the bakery. She didn't remember who Elsa was, didn't remember who Caspian was, and she no longer made the piping motion in the air with her fingers. But when Elsa came outside and sat beside her, and Caspian brought out 2 cups of coffee, Vera looked from one of them to the other, smiled, and said, "You 2 suit each other." "Yes, Grandma," Elsa said. Vera nodded, satisfied, then turned her face toward the sunlight. That afternoon, before closing, Mia brought out the first cake she had ever made entirely by herself, 2 tiers, with no plastic dowels. Caspian took the cake board, tilted it upward, and looked underneath. 3 stalks of barley were there, slightly crooked toward the left, the grains uneven, the final line trembling. He didn't correct a thing. He simply set it back down on the table, very gently, and said, "That's good. Put it in the refrigerator." There are a few things this story leaves behind. People are often quick to notice the uniform before they notice the person wearing it, and a single careless glance can cause us to miss an entire life. Kindness doesn't need to be remembered in order to have value. Vera gave without asking to know a name, and then she forgot everything. But what she gave is still helping people grow, people whose faces she will never know. And in every home, in every society, there are always people doing quiet work underneath everything else. The people who clean, the people who work through the night, the people who stand in kitchens beginning at 4 o'clock in the morning, and they are the hidden supports holding everything together. The part no one sees is the part that keeps everything standing. If today's story touched you, please leave a like and share it with someone you think may need to hear it. Subscribe to our channel so we can continue listening together each day to more warm and meaningful stories like this one. And I truly want to know how this story made you feel. Has there ever been someone in your life who quietly helped you without ever needing you to remember their name? Or have you ever been judged simply because of the work you were doing? Write a few lines in the comments. I read every story you share, and I look forward to hearing what lies deep within your heart. I wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and I'll see you again in the next video.